A different environment for chapter 2. Before the Persians. In the year 691 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib stood outside the walls of Babylon and decided to make an example. Babylon was the most prestigious city in the world. It had been the centre of civilization for 2,000 years before Sennacherib was born. It was older than Athens, it was older than Rome, it was older than written history outside Mesopotamia. Its walls were so thick that Herodotus would later claim that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Its temples reached toward gods who had been worshipped before the wheel. Its libraries held tablets that recorded the world's first laws, the world's first epic poems, the world's first astronomy. To take Babylon was to take the moral high ground of the ancient Near East. Sennacherib took it, and then he did something that even his hardened scribes were uneasy to write down. He flooded the city. He diverted the Euphrates River from its course and ran it through the streets. He had the population butchered or enslaved. He had the walls torn down stone by stone. He had the great temples levelled. The cult statue of Marduk, the god image at the spiritual heart of the city, was carried off as plunder. Then he had the entire site systematically burned and the ruins left as a warning. In his own royal inscription, Sennacherib boasted, in language preserved in his clay annals, that he made Babylon like a flooded wasteland, a place where no one would walk again. This was not a war crime by Assyrian standards, this was Assyrian policy. The Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East from roughly 911 to 612 BC, was the world's first laboratory experiment in running an empire by terror. Its kings did not invent cruelty. Every ancient state had its share, but they industrialized it. They turned brutality into a system, codified it, scaled it, and bragged about it in stone for the public to read. The Assyrians believed, with conviction of true believers, that fear was the only force that could hold a multi-ethnic state together. For nearly 300 years they were right, and then they were spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Understanding why is the entire reason this chapter exists, because everything Cyrus the Great did, everything that made the Persian Empire possible, was a deliberate response to what the Assyrians had built and how it had ended. To grasp Cyrus, you have to grasp what Cyrus was reacting against. And to grasp what he was reacting against, you have to walk through the ruins of the empire he replaced. The Assyrians came out of northern Mesopotamia, in what is now northern Iraq. Their heartland sat along the Tigris River, around 3 cities whose names still echo in the geography of the region: Ashur, Nineveh, and Calah, the modern Nimrud. They had been there for centuries, a small kingdom under the shadow of bigger powers. Until the 9th century BC, their kings figured out something the world had not seen before. They figured out how to build a professional, full-time, standing army. Before the Assyrians, ancient armies were seasonal. You called up the farmers when you needed to fight. You fought, you went home for the harvest. The Assyrians broke that cycle. They built a permanent military caste, paid in land grants and plunder, equipped with iron weapons in an age where most of their neighbours were still using bronze. They invented siege warfare on an industrial scale. They built battering rams, siege towers, sapping tunnels, mobile assault platforms. They developed cavalry tactics that would not be matched for another 500 years. By the 8th century BC, the Assyrian army was the most fearsome military instrument in human history to that point. It had no equal anywhere on the planet. And the Assyrians used it the way you would expect a society to use the world's first industrial scale war machine. They used it to conquer everyone within reach. By the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BC, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. By the reign of Sargon II, a generation later, it included most of modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and parts of Iran. By the reign of Esarhaddon in the 7th century BC, the Assyrians had briefly conquered Egypt, the first foreign power to do so since the Hyksos 1,000 years earlier. At its peak, the Assyrian Empire ruled perhaps 15 million people across nearly 1 million square miles. It was the largest political entity the world had yet seen. And it ran on terror. Not metaphorical terror, the literal, deliberate, calculated infliction of public horror as a tool of statecraft. The evidence for this is not Greek slander, it is not a Hebrew complaint, it is not a Persian propaganda piece written centuries later by the Assyrian enemies. The evidence is the Assyrians' own words, carved by their own scribes in their own palaces for their own visitors to read. The royal inscriptions of the Assyrian kings are some of the most remarkable documents in the ancient world. They are some of the most chilling. I can't read this word. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC, had this carved on the walls of his palace at Kalar. This is not very pleasant. I think we'll miss this bit out. It's deeply unpleasant what he did to people, and he wrote about it for everybody to see. It's saying this is not a soldier writing a private letter home from a bad war. This is a king dictating to a sculptor for a public monument, intended to be admired by foreign ambassadors and read by his own people. The cruelty was the message. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to be repeated. The Assyrian visual record is as brutal as the textual one. The palace reliefs, the great stone friezes that lined the throne rooms at Nineveh and Nimrud show the Assyrian war machine in graphic detail. Captives being impaled on stakes, heads stacked in pyramids outside conquered cities. And lots of other not very pleasant things. I think we'll miss that out again. The strategic logic was straightforward. If you treated one rebellious city with maximum public horror, you saved yourself the trouble of putting down rebellions in the next 10 cities. Because the next 10 cities would have heard what happens. The Assyrians were running a calculation about the economics of empire. Pacifying conquered territories by garrisoning every city was expensive. That means putting soldiers in every city. Pacifying it by reputation was cheap, so they invested heavily in reputation. The other half of the system was deportation. While the Assyrians conquered a region they considered politically dangerous, they did not simply tax it and leave a garrison. They picked up the population, or significant portions of it, and physically moved them somewhere else. The most famous case is the deportation of 10 northeastern tribes of Israel after the fall of Samarra in 722 BC, which became the legend of the lost tribes in Hebrew tradition. But Israel was one case among dozens. Modern scholars estimate that the Assyrians forcibly relocated as many as 4.5 million people over the course of their empire. They moved Babylonians to Syria, Syrians to Iran, Iranians to the Mediterranean coast. The point was to break the bond between a people and their land, because a people without land could not raise a rebellion that anyone outside their narrow valley would join. It worked. For a long time, it worked extraordinarily well. The Assyrian state held together through constant rebellion precisely because rebellion was so hideously punished. Foreign embassies arrived in Nineveh, quoting the king's titles back to him. Tribute flowed in from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains. The king's writ ran from the Nile to the Caucasus. By any contemporary measure, the Assyrians had cracked the code of empire. Except that they had not. They had built something that needed constant violence to keep functioning, and in 612 BC, the violence ran out. End of part 1. Part 2 next.